What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Paragliding Atlas. We are back with one more episode of the show, and this time around we are talking about the topic of living the dream. As the name says it, we all have some dreams when we begin the sport, and we all try our very best possible to live it. And then there are some of us who go out and prove it and share the dream with the rest of the world through various ways. You know, usually when I kind of research for an episode or I try to write intro for it, there's a lot of background information that goes through my mind that, what can I bring in the first 10, 15 seconds to keep the audience hooked, to make sure that they listen to it until the end. But there was something about Benjamin that kind of made me not want to do it, because even though I spoke with him for the first time ever in my life, I've been following him and his adventures online, like a lot of us have been in paragliding because of his exposure in the media and everything else that he does. But somehow after recording this episode, it just felt like I didn't need to, because the content of the episode was so good. So I'm not going to spill any beans for obvious reasons, but easiest way to find out is that give this episode a listen. To me, it was just like talking to a friend, and I think you guys will feel the same. These are just two old friends catching up and talking about how to dream, believe, and achieve. But still, out of curiosity, if you're thinking, why am I hyping this up so much? This guy has multiple world records and has done things which a lot of us would plan to for sure, but might not be able to complete if we do not have the willpower and the mindset and everything else around it that is required to pull these adventures through. So here it is, Benjamin Jordan in part 1. That's another thing, because the episode was so enriching that it just went much beyond the usual planned time for an episode, for a listen. So that's why I was like, we'll split it into 2 so that the listeners can schedule their listening accordingly. And that's why this is part 1. Part 2 is coming out shortly. It's already in post-production. So as I always say, stay tuned, stay excited. The magic has just begun. Benjamin Jordan, what an absolute honor to have a pilot of your stature on Paragliding Atlas, man. Thank you so much for coming.
Hey, thanks for talking to me today. Thank you for inviting me to be part of what you're doing. I was able to check some of it out, and I don't know, I started getting excited again. It's been I've had a little bit of a break from my passion, only because I've got these loose, tiny children that I have to help raise right now. And I really value resources like yours that just keep people stoked no matter what's going on for them. So thank you for doing what you do, and thank you for including me.
Awesome. Benjamin, I was just wondering when I was preparing for the show that no one single podcast episode can basically do justice to the amount of feats that you have accomplished in our sport. And we have very limited time, but we will try and cover as many aspects as possible. But to begin with, out of curiosities, how many world records do you have to your name, man?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think, not too many. And world records are funny things, right? Because as soon as you set them, someone else tries to or succeeds in breaking them because you bring the record into the spotlight, right? So my first project, and it's a bit of a side note, was skateboarding across Canada. And that was, at the time, that was a world record. And then flying a powered paraglider back the other direction across Canada, which was at the time also a world record. And then just most recently, I say most recently because relatively speaking, during COVID, flying from Mexico to Canada, which still stands as a free flying Vol-Biv world record.
Got it, Benjamin. So basically, when I was researching more about these, one thing that stood out was these are not ordinary adventures. Like, we all want to go out and have fun. And then there are some of your kind which want to go out and have fun in a whole different manner. So what I'm curious is that how do you conceptualize these, man? How do you plan these adventures? What's the drive? What's the motivation behind such crazy amounts of adventure seeking?
Oh, wow. Okay. How can I be succinct? I think that it's important to first state that where they are born, it's almost like babies having babies, because when I first discovered paragliding back in 2003, my goal as a complete novice, like I hadn't even done a forward launch yet. My goal was to fly from Mexico to Canada. This was a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. And I was pretty sure that I was going to do it the next summer. And again, I had never actually clipped into a paraglider before. And so I learned to paraglide and I loved it. I loved it. And I was even more certain that was going to happen. But then I quickly realized, like, whoa, XC, like that, you've got to catch these thermal things. That's crazy. They're invisible. How can I do this? It's in my heart, but it's not in my brain. It's not in my experience. I've never met anyone that could do that. How could I do it? And so from there, that baby of an idea that had birthed in my mind, it had a baby. And it was like, wait a second, look, these people strapping motors to their backs. Okay, they don't have to worry about so many of these different elements that I'm not good at. So I'll just do that and I'll just fly really far using one of those. But long story short, that also requires a fair bit of skill, and it requires some money to support that kind of a thing and to acquire that stuff. So then that baby, that had another baby, and that was, what can I do? I just learned to paraglide. I don't have any money. I don't have any paragliding skill. What can I do? I realized, well, I can walk and I can skateboard. And so I said, okay, so let's just do something on the skateboard and see how that goes. And that's how that all started. And I wound up on this massive skateboarding expedition across Canada. And I learned so much in the process, so much about organizing long distance projects, so much about working with teammates, so much about fundraising, so much. And it was incredibly enjoyable. I learned so much about my country, so much that I realized I don't have to stay in Toronto anymore, where I was born and grew up. I could live anywhere. There's nice people everywhere. I don't have to be afraid. I learned so much from that baby of a baby. And so these ideas that somehow seem like they've come out of left field, that it's always just a matter of boiling the big idea down and getting rid of all of the, okay, I can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. Okay, well, what's left? And so what's left is what I would focus on. And then, not ironically, I can't think of the word, but organically, a project like that, for instance, skateboarding across Canada, that would give me the skills that I needed to then move to the next step and experience that baby's parent, which was powered paragliding across Canada, right? And then from that point, so on and so forth. Now we're free flying across the United States.
That sounds so interesting. And like hearing you talk about how you made it all happen is basically, you structured it very well, like reproduction of ideas, eventually coming down to knowing your reality and what is possible and then going for it. But this kind of makes me curious, and I'm sure some of our audiences can also resonate with this. Is there some sort of manifestation behind this, Benjamin? Like, how does your visualization look like when you're thinking about these things? Of course, we all have our own way of dreaming and trying to have an idea. Even I had expectations before the flying, and then reality comes, and then you retune your expectations. But from what I see is that you are very successfully able to navigate the expectation versus reality towards the point of manifesting it into what you want. So can you help our audiences understand a little bit, like, how does your visualization in this context look like, and what does, when it really comes down to putting to work, is that makes it count for you eventually?
Sure. Okay. I think that this one thing that I learned early on, and I have to learn this again and again, pretty much every day, but it's really valuable, is that in order to avoid that feeling of disappointment that we know on big scale, on small scale, we have to be acutely aware of when there is an embedded expectation. Somehow, whenever there's an expectation, there can be a surprise to the upside. You can be blown away, but that you'd have to have really set the bar low for yourself to have that feeling. So if you're someone like me who wants to set a high bar for themselves, it's a fine line to walk. And it's important to keep an eye on that bar and say, you know what, that bar is there, that bar is high, but I don't need to meet that bar today. An example I would like to give from my life shortly before I got into paragliding was that I wanted to become a leader inside of a community that actually didn't even exist yet in my city of Toronto. I was 23, it was 2003, and I was taking a leadership course. And so I had to organize an event as part of my homework. And I realized I don't want to be a leader in the photography community, in the fashion photography community. That was what I was at the time. I don't want to be a leader amongst my friend group, my friends from high school, which is still the people I hung out with at the time. I want to meet more people that are into skateboarding, that are into longboarding. And I organized an event in Toronto called the Board Meeting. And it was tongue in cheek because essentially it was a huge flash mob that I envisioned where all these skateboarders would come together dressed up like businessmen and businesswomen. And we would take over the city of Toronto. Toronto, for your listeners that don't know, is like the New York City of Canada. It's like our business. So I just thought it would be hilarious if everyone was congesting the city on skateboards wearing business attire. I still think it's hilarious. And so I put up all these signs all over the city. I didn't know many longboarders at the time, and longboarding was not popular back then, not in Toronto anyway. And so I put up all these signs. I got on the radio a little bit, and I was even threatened by the police. They told me, like, this is actually not a legal sport. You can't organize an event like this. You don't have a permit. And I was really nervous going into it. But what I was really nervous about was not being thrown in jail or fined. It was actually that nobody would show up. And of all the reporters that I had convinced to interview me so I could gain publicity for this project, people kept saying, hey, how many people do you expect? How many people do you expect? I'd never done anything like this before in my life. And I realized that was the question that kept stressing me out. And I was saying, I don't know, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 40. And at some point, I realized that I need to get rid of that expectation. How many people are going to show up? And so people would ask me, how many people are going to show up? And I'd say, at least one. And that's okay, because that's the first year. This is the inaugural board meeting. Maybe only one person shows up. Maybe it's just me. But as long as I show up, then the next year, maybe 2 people will show up. And then the next year, maybe 4 people will show up, and then so on and so forth. As soon as I got over that it could just be me, and that would still be a successful event, the event would go on, I didn't worry anymore about how many people would show up. And instead, I could just put my energy into promoting it, to spreading the word, and inviting people to come when I saw them on the street, yada, yada. And so, long story short, 50 people showed up. And that was mind-blowing for me and for everybody involved. Nobody that rode longboards could have imagined 50 of them, of their peers, all together for one event. And we had a great time. The next year, 100 people showed up. The next year, 150 people showed up. I only ran the event for 3 years. And then I left the city on that skateboarding across Canada trip. But my peers continued to run the event, and they continue to run it to this day. It would have just had its 21st anniversary. And now something to the tune of 2,000 or 3,000 people show up, even if it's raining, for this event. And it's important to recognize that I would have killed this baby before it was even born if I had continued to be so paralyzed by fear of that maybe nobody would show up. And I appreciate this feels far away from paragliding, because this is more to do with like the rejection of my peers and people saying, hey, this is not a good idea. And some people did say that. But the bigger picture for me and what I learned from it was to not be concerned about how it went, but just to try and to document whatever it is and to recognize that as valid. Because when you look back on it, big picture, 20 years, hey, it would have been cool if I was the only person there. That would have been a real, I feel, milestone, because after 20 years, there would still be 2,000, 3,000 people there. And so I feel like that freeing myself of that expectation, not being worried about the numbers in this case, which is really what matters for an event like this. I feel was a big part of that, and just embracing the idea of failure in that. And then that idea of being okay with failure has allowed me to plan these much, much more extravagant projects where it'd be very easy for me to fail in one way or another.
Got it. This does resonate with a lot of other kind of advice that some of the most esteemed guests and some brilliant pilots in our sport has given on the show earlier. But one kind of clarification that I would request you to throw some more light on, and that is, a lot of them say that forget about the end result, just keep on working on your craft until you reach wherever you want to, or enjoy the journey. And one important essence of the fact is that I hear this a lot, where they say that keep on doing it as long as it's fun. Now, failure, or the expectation, having the kind of expectation of failure or challenges, are not fun at all. There are times when, let's say, even a normal cross-country flight, you will hit turbulence, you will have to go outside your comfort zone, and there will be times during that adventure when it will not be fun. Drawing a thin line between giving up when it is not fun. Of course, the flight is it's not the best example here, because you're dealing with safety and a lot of other things as well. It's a very dynamic adventure, but chasing such other adventures like this, which are long-term and spread over a period of days, even if it's raining and even if not enough people show up and it's not fun, is there a strategy that you put to your mind where you were like, I'm just going to block off all of this? I don't know if negativity is the correct word for it, but I'm not getting the expectations from it, and I'm still going to keep on working on the craft. Like, how do you navigate when the journey is not so fun, still going towards it?
Well, yeah, I think that a big part of it is because I hear what you're saying about things not being fun. And I think that a big part of it is to really try to cut yourself a lot of slack. And inside of paragliding projects, for me, what that looks like, because we all know about para-waiting, right, is that I don't assume that I'm going to be able to finish a project that should take me a week inside of a week. I give myself months and months to be able to do something that maybe a better pilot or a luckier pilot could do in a week. Because I find that as long as I have enough time, then I don't feel the pressure. I don't feel the pressure to make poor choices in terms of when I fly. I don't feel the pressure I don't feel like I'm going to fail just because my first flight was only 50K and it should have been 150K. And now I'm not going to reach that target. So it gives me a lot more room to treat myself like one of those parents it's okay. You can do anything you set your mind to. And then just keep reminding myself that I really do have a lot of time. And I think that's one thing, especially in my life pre-parenthood, that I was able to afford myself, that I think is really important for other people who want to chase their dreams, especially when it comes to paragliding, is to really set an unrealistic amount of time aside to be able to do it, and recognize, hey, if I get done with this quick, then I can do whatever I want. I can start editing sooner. I could go on another trip. I could go hang out with my friends. I could go to the beach, but give myself that extra few weeks, few months, whatever it is, to be able to finish. And incredibly, if I look back on all of my projects, I've never finished early. I almost always finish at the maximum amount of time that I had, regardless of the circumstance. And so that's how important it is for me to have carved out all of that time that may seem unreasonable from the get-go, in terms of being able to finish a project, but also finish the project, but also enjoy that journey, that I'm not stressing out over, am I even going to finish this? Meanwhile, I'm trying to get to Canada. I'm still in Arizona. I don't have to stress out about that it took me 2 months to fly across Arizona when I was only budgeting for a month for each state, because I'd given myself an extra month. And so I used it there, right? Just, sorry, not to jump ahead, but I think that's an important part, is just to really cut some slack, let the dog off the leash. It needs to smell that fire hydrant for a few extra minutes. That's okay.
That's a beautiful analogy. But, I don't really want to corner you with the follow-up question, Benjamin, but let's say some of us
Okay.
do not have that luxury of time. Because, of course, if you are blessed enough to have unlimited time or something, and I'm just putting it in my shoes, I'm putting myself in these shoes, that, all right, I have this Paragliding Atlas podcast project that I'm working on, and of course, there are expectations versus reality. Is it 100 listeners? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? Am I going to make it? Is the show going to be super successful? Or what's going to happen? Will it allow me to live my dreams? And then the time constraint comes that, all right, you are on borrowed time because I moved from Asia to Europe to try and chase this passion and make it a reality. And then, of course, I have to justify my visa status and everything else. Personal challenges, personal goals. Everything comes down to putting in the effort versus the timely reward that should come before a specific time. Otherwise, you have to change your direction and then chase it through a whole... You just have to do some tweaks. So, of course, your kind of outlook works very well for people who have the privilege. But for someone who might not be having that kind of luxury, what would you say how to navigate this as successfully as possible without losing out too much on your goals?
Okay, so I feel like we're almost having a conversation of supply and demand here, right? Where I could further elaborate into someone who might... Look, let me give you a little bit more of a picture of who I have been, so that, because people might hear, how do you have 3 months to do this? How do you have 5 months to do that? So back in, it was 2008, I had just flown a powered paraglider across Canada. I was making a film. It was like my first film about that. It's called The Canadian Dream. And I wanted to do more of that. And I wanted to do it as a free-flying paraglider pilot. But I knew that I was going to have to invest a ton of energy into that. I knew that there wasn't a ton of money involved, going to be a lot of money involved, especially at the beginning, from what I could tell. So I thought, I can't do this and continue to pay my rent and continue to live in this town the way that I am and all of these things. So if I can't do what I love and meet the overhead that I've got here, then what I can either do is change what I'm doing and no longer do what I love so I can meet the overhead, or reduce my overhead to match what I'm able to achieve with what I love. So I literally reduced my overhead, and I took the school bus that I had purchased to follow me across Canada for my assisted powered paraglider record project, and I converted it into a winterized cabin good enough for Canadian winters. And I lived in that, and I had a plan to live in that thing for 10 years, and I did that. And during that time, I paid almost no rent. I lived rurally. I grew a lot of my own food, and I stocked up on stuff, and I lived in a very humble way in order to be able to afford myself the time to do whatever the heck I wanted to do, and not to have to worry about paying my bills and all of this kind of stuff. So I appreciate that's also not extremely realistic for most people out there, but the point is realistic, which is that, look, okay, so you're in a different position, right? You have this dream, but you've got this job, you've got these children, these are things that I'm familiar with now. Okay, so now, because I can't take on my other strategy of living like a squatter in a school bus that I don't have any bills. Now I've got some bills. Now I have these children that I love and I want to spend time around. So now I can't adjust the overhead. I can't move my family into the school bus, right? I do have bills to pay. So now that's a hard limit, and I do have less time. So now what I have to do is I actually have to adjust the other end. I have to create projects for myself that accommodate that are realistic inside of that. So now I have to downscale those in order to meet that reality. And so it would be unrealistic for me right now to think that I could go and allocate 5 months to paragliding from Mexico to Canada, given my current lifestyle. So in the past, I changed my lifestyle. I reduced all my overhead in order to accommodate going on these large, expensive, time-consuming projects. Now I can't change the lifestyle nearly as much. So now I'm going to have to adjust the projects in order to meet them. But at the end of the day, that's all it is. You've got, if your key is fixed, then you have to adjust the lock. If your lock is fixed, then you can adjust your key.
Words of wisdom.
Sorry, so many analogies. I truly apologize. I like your questions and I like this conversation, but I hope that this sounds reasonable to your listeners.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And I hope the audience appreciates it too, because it's coming straight from your heart and you're putting it as simply as possible. That I think, to sum it up, it's like figure out your resources and then figure out your plans and then try and meet a sweet spot and go discover that yourself, because you're the only one who can answer that. Nobody else can do it for you. And then you just make some magic.
I imagine that you've got a lot of younger listeners too. People are getting into paragliding, they're younger and younger, and people that are trying to chase these things and hear maybe some ideas from older pilots like me might be listening right now. And I feel like those ones there, they probably have a lot of societal pressure, like I did, to live in a certain way, look a certain way, drive a certain car. All these things, those are, I'll just speak to those ones directly. Those are the ones that can seriously make a change, like I did back when I was, 28, to say, I'm just going to do everything I can to reduce my budget, to reduce my cost of living so that I have the freedom and the flexibility to do whatever I want for the next, whatever it was. In my case, I bought myself 10 years. And inside of that 10 years is really how I built my career to this point. I could not have done that. And taken on these things. I couldn't have just disappeared and gone to Malawi to teach some guy to paraglide with 2 days notice. And now I'm gone for 2 months to do this project. If I had any sort of commitments, if I was doing anything other than just living in a school bus in the woods where nobody knew, right? And these kinds of things would have been completely unrealistic if I was still trying to live in a nice place and have all these bills that I had to negotiate and had to pay and all these jobs that I had to do on the side in order to get by. So just to those folks, whether you're young or you're not, if you can bring down that insane overhead, that insane cost of living today, which really everyone's dealing with it. Everyone's dealing with the insane costs of today. If you can just bring that way down, you may find yourself in a position where you can just all of a sudden pick up and go, and you can dream about being in India today, and then you could be there in a week and feel very comfortable. That was my life for a very long time, and that is what has allowed me to create the things that everyone's so interested in knowing about.
Indeed, and I think this just brings back the most beautiful and famous saying that where there's a will, there's a way, and I've seen a lot of super successful people just apply this and make it happen. So if you really want it, you will figure it out. It's as simple as that, I think.
And just really don't feel that there's really any value in the narrative that society is placing on you. Even to just, I'm not going to give examples because everyone's got their own feelings of pressure. But those things aren't real. They're just ideas, and they're only as real as we make them. And if those things aren't working for you, and maybe they'll work for you down the road, maybe they are important, but maybe they're not important like this year or this decade. Understand that what's important to you right now is what's important to you. And you didn't ask me about this, but it's this little thing that I keep in the back of my mind, which is that when people do something that they love versus doing something that they don't love, it is said that they are something around 10 times more effective. So if you are doing something right now that you don't love, you are 10 times less effective inside of whatever it is that you're doing than the thing that you're thinking about doing. So I would strongly encourage people to really consider adjusting their big expectations as far as how society views them, and to consider making some change in order to be able to steer more towards or directly towards the things that they are most passionate about, because that's the impact that we can have, right? That it's the 10x returns that we want to get and that we want to offer the world, not the 1x doing something that we don't like just to be able to get by. Anyway.
This is so cool. While listening to this, I'm getting goosebumps that why aren't we told this in the school or in the classrooms that... Because
somehow, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this, we're not told this stuff in school because it just doesn't, like, we live inside of this huge system, and I'm not going to be someone that's saying that it's being controlled by any one person or any one entity or group. I don't have to believe that. I just know that everything in our universe exists inside of equilibrium. And so in order for our species to continue to be what it is, like a colony of bees, you've got the one queen, right? And then you've got all these workers. And in order, and all those workers are so important because they need to keep that queen alive, because that queen keeps the order. And we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be a worker or are we going to be a queen? And it's not possible for everyone to be a queen. And so I feel like the schools, for instance, they're there organically to create the balance that's required to create enough workers to support the queen. There's so many things, like the things that I've talked to you about, but also just really just like the basics of investing economically and the compounding effects of all that stuff. You just don't learn that stuff. Although it would be wise for them, it would serve us if they taught it to us in 3rd or 4th grade, and that we would really start that kind of stuff really young and not just be frivolous, consumers. But in order for our country's GDPs to be what they are, we need to consume blindly. And so there's so many things like this where hopefully podcasts like yours are helping turn the lights on for people who are experiencing a little bit of darkness.
Indeed, and I think Paragliding Atlas is all about sharing knowledge, but I think we basically circled back to the theory of evolution, or Darwinism, as most of the people say, that it's survival of the fittest. So if you want to go ahead and chase something that is not the usual path, then go out and do something which is not the usual path, and then be ready to pay the price on the way. And the harder you chase it, the higher you go, basically.
Man, I honestly, feel free to edit this, because I appreciate I can be a little bit long-winded, but there's this other aspect, and you might be able to use this at any point in this interview, but there's this thing called that I would love to share. And it was a thing that I learned while skiing with my friend on a ski hill many moons ago. We would go to the ski hill almost every day. We had a season's pass. Again, the privilege of living in a school bus. And we would always be looking for the best snow. And we found that on a lot of days, it hadn't snowed for a week or two and there was no good snow. But then we invented this thing called awkward lines. Awkward lines was that it was the idea that, okay, if you just keep following the path of least resistance from the top of the lift down to the bottom of the ski lift, you're going to keep hitting the same thing that Beth and Veronica and James all hit, whether it's a black run, a green run, a jump, whatever it is. But if you go out of your way to look for 2 or 3 birch trees that would be really awkward to fit your body through, and you just try to fit your body through there, not only is behind those birch trees going to be a fresh stash of untouched snow, but from that point, even if you took the path of least resistance from that point, you would end up hitting all this extra cool snow, because nobody started from that awkward point. So whenever we found one of these things, we were in the forest, we were like 20 meters apart from each other going, woohoo, we'd say awkward lines. And that would let the other one know, hey, look, I just found this really awkward spot. Get in here. Let's get in here and see what happens. And that's a great visual representation of not following the herd, but not being so contrarian that it's painful, just making a couple choices and then following the path of least resistance and starting from that awkward place, starting with that awkward line. Does that sound okay to you?
That sounds wonderful, man. And there's no editing required for such amazing content.
The funny part in my mind, maybe you won't find this funny, is awkward lines. I imagine whenever you yell awkward lines, you have to crack your voice. You have the awkward lines. Like
all right, awkward lines it is, and I'm so happy to choose my awkward line.
Very awkward.
Yeah, but I think I'm not going to take this point forward and let the audience process it the way they want it to, because I think you just put it very beautifully across. And for anybody who just wants to re-listen to it, just hit the 15-second rewind button on Spotify or whatever you listen this to, and it's nothing but words of wisdoms right there, I would say. I really want to bring up this question that I had saved up for a later part of the episode, but we are having such a beautiful conversation around this point, and Paragliding Atlas is all about, this show is all about showing the truth and the reality and all aspects of the sport that we do. You can call it inherent, I wouldn't say inherent fear, but inherent doubt or something, but there are highs and lows in any kind of lifestyle that you chase. And chasing dreams comes at a cost, undoubtedly. So what I'm wondering is, the lifestyle that you have lived and made for yourself, we have talked about how to make it and how glorious it is and how much it gives back to you. But are there any downsides to it that you'd like to share, man, that you have felt at times like this was hard? And every path has its own obstacles, and if there is any discussion of hardships that you can present to our audience, if any, I'm not saying just make them up for this question, but I'd love to have your idea on that perspective as well.
No? I mean, because, okay, I'm not, okay, throughout my journey, okay, so not right now, but throughout my journey, and this is, I think, really important because people may be just starting their journey or they may be on their journey. I don't like to use the word depression casually because I have a sense that maybe I have no idea what the extent of genuine depression is for people that have it. And so I'm not trying to say that I have lived that, but I think that everyone has their own experience of that in some way. If you've had an extreme high, then it's not hard to feel an extreme low. And I would say that none of the things that I've done, and let's just start with the skateboarding across Canada, have really resulted in any kind of like lasting euphoria that I would imagine. Here I am, I'm skateboarding across Canada every day for 5 months and 9 days. I'm meeting all these people. I'm shaking their hands. I'm seeing their smiles. We're in the media. And I just feel like I'm on the moon. And I'm thinking, this is it. Like my life I'm just going to bawl, like not crying. I'm going to be bawling, have this epic life from now on. Thank you. Thank you, universe, for giving me this gift, this privilege. But a year later, I'll find myself like a blackout drunk alcoholic, now living in Vancouver with no friends because I've left Toronto in pursuit of living in the mountains, being a paraglider, but not knowing how I'm going to make that transition from, okay, yeah, great. That's great. But you skateboarded across Canada, but you can't get the support to fly a powered paraglider across Canada. You don't know how to do that. You're feeling too insecure. And all of those epic euphoric feelings that you were feeling while skateboarding across Canada, they're nowhere to be found. So why don't you just have a drink? Okay, why don't you have 2? Why don't you have 3? Until the point that like you've actually got a problem. So that's just one example of me going through a real down period between these journeys. I don't think that it's easy to argue that would be a real downside and a real risk to someone like myself. Maybe not everyone has the same personalities where they could become so addicted to something like alcohol. But even then, long story short, I left Vancouver. I went to Nepal for 5 months with the goal of learning to be a great cross-country pilot and get sober. I became an okay cross-country pilot in Nepal, and I did get sober. And so paragliding saved me from that, and it gave me the sobriety and steered me towards what it was that I needed to do to convert skateboarding into powered paragliding. But then the same thing happened. I think it was either 2009 or 2010. I think it was 2009. I flew across Canada in the powered paraglider. Again, absolute euphoria, world record. Oh my goodness, on all the news. And then a year later, I'm completely lost because now I've done this next incredible thing, but how am I going to keep that going, right? How am I going to get there again? Because you've touched the moon and now you're back on Earth. And all you can think about, again, is how do I get back to the moon? But that's not where the inspiration comes from, right? The inspiration comes from an idea that sort of tickles your soul. And then just by following that, watering that seed, let's just say, it grows into a plant that happens to touch the moon, or it doesn't. But it's not just that you want to touch the moon. And I would keep getting trapped. And I feel like to this day, I still get trapped in that. And it can be incredibly unsatisfying. And I've learned to cope with it more now. And I wouldn't really call it, I wouldn't even venture to call it depression now, because I've seen it come and go so many times. But it has felt that way many times. And I've been stuck in those ruts for, let's just say, a year at a time, until something happens. I have some sort of a dream, either while I'm asleep or while I'm awake, and it gives me this little flicker of light, just this little flicker. And I realize, oh, well, I got to feed that. I have to feed that. Let me write about it. Let me talk about it to somebody. Let me do a little bit of research. Let me just keep feeding that fire and see if I can grow it into a blaze. And that's where every single one of these ideas has come from, right? But there is a prolonged period of darkness, I would say, that precedes that blaze. And that would be a major downside, I think, for having such highs.
I love your honesty, man. Not a lot of people are this transparent while sharing their journeys and all the adventures, and the way you're putting it across is nothing but pure gold. I cannot believe the amount of value you're adding to my show and the audiences out there. So thank you, man. It's an absolute honor.
This is my honor.
Love it. You know, when just quickly, I want to touch upon this fact. When you say there's a light or there's a thought, do you believe there's a stronger power or some kind of thing helping you push? Just out of curiosity, not divulging into any other topic, but just how does that happen? Or is it just the way of life, the way you have lived ever since while growing up? That's how your life was.
I couldn't deny that there are forces that are greater than I or anyone really can imagine. I say or anyone because I feel like it's important for me anyway, to recognize that anyone who thinks that they have the answer probably doesn't. And that this is to just point at any of, I don't know, what are there, thousands of different like religions that people follow around the world. I feel like these are great ideas and great codes to live by, but to also recognize that there may be an even greater force that is connecting all of this. And what do I say first here? I've done a lot of presentations, usually before and after a film. And almost always there's someone in the audience that wants to come up to me after the Q&A and talk to me about God, because I'm not talking about God in my films. I'm not talking about God in my Q&A, but they see me talking about God when I'm answering some of the questions or when I've presented something in a film. And I'm always polite and I listen, but I did not grow up in a religious capacity, and I have traveled. I'm very lucky to have traveled around the world and seen so many different people with so many different gods, and see their passion for that and see them being great people because of that passion. And I respect that and wouldn't choose to change anything about anyone that's doing right by their neighbor and being a great contributing member to society in whatever they're doing. But none of those stories, none of those things that people want to use to explain the world away really make sense to me. If there were to be some greater force that I think everyone could be humbled by, and that continues to humble me every day that I'm privileged to go for a walk with my son or my family, is the power of nature. The power, and I don't just mean a tree growing over there, a plant growing over there, like the atmosphere, the water, the way that the gravity works, which is nature, not just within our universe, our world, but nature within our greater universe. All of this is having an incredible effect on us. And as human beings, I feel scratched the surface to know that, wow, this is big. But I don't think any of us really have a sense of how big. But that thing that is that big truly is impacting us. And so I would just say, whatever you believe in, if it's working for you, if it makes you feel great, then just keep believing in it. I believe in, I don't want to sound cliche and say I believe in the universe, right? I believe in something that is so big that I can't even begin to imagine it. But I do believe that I am completely, and we are all completely being affected by that thing. And so all that can leave me feeling is infinitely humble. And I feel like that does help inside of dealing with some of these expectations that we talk about of what is it that we can achieve, but then also dealing with the expectations of the sort of, to use an expression like the negative Nancy inside of us, because the negative Nancy says, and no offense to Nancy's out there, but that tells us what we can't achieve. And so let's also be humble there, right? And realize that the truth is we have no idea. All we can do is go out and try. But that, to answer your question, that is the force that I believe in, is the force that is so far beyond me that I couldn't even begin to describe it.
No, I love it, man. Of course, there's no way to put a definition on this because everybody has their own way of defining such a feeling or such a power. But I think this circles back to what you said earlier in the show, that you are 10 times more productive when you do something that you want. And it reminds you of a very famous proverb or saying from back home. I don't know if this is universal, but it should be. And it goes that when you really want something so bad, the universe conspires to give it to you in all its abundance, provided you put in the effort and you do the needful and everything. So I think the bottom line is, when you decide that you want this, and there are times when there are challenges, regardless, because you really still want it so bad from the bottom of your heart and it's a low phase or something, the universe or that higher power or whatever you can define it figures out a way to bring you out of that and show you, shine the light and guide you on the paths to get back and chasing glory and making it happen, I guess. I think on that note, Benjamin, we have run out of time for this part. Initially, I thought I'll bring you on board for the topic of flying and filming, but the way this conversation is going, this is more like living the dream. So what we're going to do is we're going to save the flying and filming part for the second edition of this episode. So for now, it's been an absolute honor and a pleasure. Please do stay tuned to all our audiences, because part 2 of how to make your dreams come true on screen and share it with all the audiences across the globe is coming up, and Benjamin is here to guide us through it.
With an unexpected twist.